After d4, d5. The Blackmar Diemer Gambit happens when white plays e4.
Black needs to take the pawn, and now either f3 or knight c3. F3 is going to come anyway, so the gambit consists of giving up the e4 pawn for the development of the knight. I've personally met this many times, and I'm sure most of you have encountered this a lot. And you got to be very careful because of the development of the white player. But once you know how to exploit the winning pattern, then you will not lose any more with this. After knight c3, black continues with knight f6. And by the way, let's give up the idea of controlling this pawn in e4 forever. It's just not going to happen. What we need to do is go on with development as well and clamp on the weaknesses of white. After f3, we take the pawn. And now white takes back. Now the crucial move to remember is c6. It's important because we need to stop the potential arrival of the pawn in d5, which will kick away our knight if we were to play knight in c6, and then we have a problem in development. White's got, when white castles, the rook will be on an open file, and the two bishops are both ready to go. So c6 is important. Also because we don't have a pawn in the center, and the fact that the white player gambled the e4 pawn, he did it for a reason. Now we don't have any pawn in the center, and we really cannot push the pawn to e5, and e6 will be too passive because we need to get this bishop, the light square bishop, out before we play e6. So c6 is perfect. Now white continues with the thematic bishop c4. He's got to develop the piece and then castle. The whole point of giving up the f pawn is that you can have a rook on an open file already. So bishop to f5, and after castling, now we play e6. And we're simply up a pawn. There is no compensation for white. From this situation, we're going to look at two moves. Bishop to f4 and knight to h4. After bishop to f4, black continues bishop to e7. And then queen e2, and black plays b5. So that's how this game is continued. We're going to castle king side, so we don't really worry about the empty squares around the queen side. We're actually just going to start throwing the pawns and gain some space. Let's remember that we're up a pawn and we're out of the opening. We survived it well. The evaluation here says that black is just quite better due to material advantage, and also there are no weaknesses in the black's territory. And now there's like, a million moves that can happen. So we're out of theory. There's no way that we could possibly analyze this, or because it's an open game, it's very difficult to force every single move. So we're just looking how the game goes on, more or less. These are the best moves that white can play. Yet white now goes back to, for example, to b3 if he wants to preserve the pieces, because now simplifying, going to d3 and simplifying will just be favorable for black. After castling, the best move by white, a4. Black continues with b4. So still, we're gaining space on the queen side. And after knight to d1, black's best move is to simply play bishop g6, also to avoid the waste of tempo after knight e3, which is coming for sure. And the black player wants to play knight to d5 as soon as possible and just go for a winning endgame. So after bishop to g6, knight e3 isn't really that much of a problem. We're just going to play knight d5 and preserve the bishop pair. And here the black player has an advantage of about 2 points. It's a very comfortable endgame. White just gave up a pawn for nothing, basically. Back in this position, white can try the thematic knight to h4, attacking the bishop, so that when the bishop moves, the knight will just trade for the bishop, and white player wins the bishop pair and even gets to maybe break the pawn structure. This doesn't work because of bishop takes pawn in c2. And yeah, that's just the free pawn. And black is already up a pawn, so even if the queen didn't take the bishop and the bishop were to get away, like for example, and then get traded, still we'd be up 2 pawns. There's just no reason not to. So if the queen takes and the black player goes on with the idea of having won the bishop pair, queen takes, then we will just recapture the bishop. So in this position, another move that I've encountered a lot is knight to g5. It's part of the repertoire of those who play the Blackmar Diemer Gambit. So knight to g5, the idea is to take in f7. And once the knight takes in f7 and we take back, because the knight was forking 2 pieces, so we have to take back, this pawn in e6 is pinned, and that gives white some scary counterplay. Of course, we cannot allow that to happen. So after knight to g5, black goes on with bishop to g6. So white's best move now, and the plan that the white players who play this opening and this specific plan of knight g5, the move that they go through is knight to e2, the idea of knight f4, and then putting more and more pressure over e6, sacrificing a knight for a very strong attack, which is the whole point of gambits. Usually gambits come for a reason. So you're gonna have to make an attack, because otherwise there would be no point in giving up material. Black continues with bishop to d6, and after knight to f4, here's the crucial move. We have to take the knight. Otherwise that attack would have been too strong and too dangerous. So bishop takes back, and simply now black castles, and black is once again in this scenario survived the opening, and there is no compensation for black. So after knight goes back to f3, since we were going to kick the knight away anyway, knight to d5, attacking the bishop. And so now the bishop can't really retreat to g3 because of knight e3 winning for black. And if bishop goes to d2 to guard the square e3, black continues with queen to b6 and exploit this weak pawn in d4. Yeah, it can be pushed, c3 can be pushed, but we're also attacking b2. And yes, we're just applying pressure on d4. It is protected at the moment, so after rook to b1, most logical move, knight to d7. The idea is for the black player to play knight e5 and get traded with the knight in f3. So after a4, best move by white, knight e5 while the pawn is pinned. And taking the knight here, of course, it will be met with a fork, so we'd be winning a pawn. So the knight's attacking the bishop. White's player best move is bishop to a2, still remaining on this diagonal. But now we can take the knight, and we have an attack on this pawn. So let's make a recap. e4 is taken, knight c3, knight f6, f3, and we take. So we stay up a pawn. And now crucial move is c6. Earlier we went through bishop c4. What happens after another move that seems to be making much sense as well is bishop to d3. Now we exploit the weakness, which is this loose pawn in d4. Immediately we play bishop to g4, the idea of taking the knight and winning the pawn. So let's have a look at this scenario. Let's say, for example, white castles. And I've encountered this as well. This is when the white player gives up even more material. It can be scary, especially if you don't have the certainty of what you're doing and you're afraid that your opponent might know more than he actually does. So, well, castling, then we just take, queen takes, and then take the pawn. Check, and now white bishop continued with e3. And it looks like, okay, white gave up 2 pawns compared to black, but at the same time it's got everything developed, including the castle king, the rook on an open file. It kind of looks very good, but it's not, because the queen goes to g4. For if we were to be able to swap, then we will be winning, because we will be simplifying. So after queen to f2, refusing the swap, e6. h3 is met by queen to h5, staying with the queen on the opponent king's side. No reason to get passive. So white's best move now is bishop to d4, the idea of applying more and more pressure over the square f6 and ruining the castle of the black player. So knight b to d7 is obvious here to protect the knight. And after bishop to e2, attacking the queen, queen to g5. We're just out of theory now, but you have survived the opening once again. There's absolutely no compensation for white. Black is up material, and black is just simply safe. A move like bishop to e3 here can simply be met by, because I've encountered this as well, where you can just take the bishop and then just go on to the endgame and win. In this scenario, after the bishop went to d3 move instead of bishop to c4, bishop to g4 we played. And what happens if white protects the pawn in e3 instead of castling, giving up the other pawn? Then we continue with the thematic e6. And after now, white can actually castle without losing the pawn in d4. Black continues with bishop to h5. This move doesn't need to be provoked. The idea is eventually to go to g6 anyway and swap, especially with this very strong bishop. And yeah, I mean, we are in favor of simplifying because it's a gambit and we've accepted it. So after a move like queen to e1, thematic in this moment, and knight to d7, developing the knight. Queen to g3 is met by bishop to g6, so we're finally able to just go and start swapping stuff. So white's very logical. Okay, like bishop takes, that will open up the file for our rook, and we might even think of not castling anymore. But knight e5 is this idea of the white player's thematic here, basically put more attack over the bishop, open the file for the rook on the f7, put more pressure on f7. This is met by bishop to d6. And best move by white now is queen to h3 according to the engine, since we were pinning the knight. Now, as we said, we want to simplify in this endgame. We no longer have to worry about the queen being in g3 and attacking the weak g7 square. So now we can take this bishop, double up the pawn structure and isolating the pawns of our opponent. They look really terrible. So after knight takes back, in order to safeguard the integrity of the pawn structure, black continues with castling. And again, black has reached absolute safety. Nothing to worry at all here, just feel comfortable in this situation. After rook a to e1 activated the last piece of the black player, black plays queen to a5, developing the queen, and we're ready to just go for a favorable endgame. Let's just look at a couple of more moves. Like after bishop to f4, white could have an idea of trading and double up, like probably maybe take back with the rook and then double up the rooks. Come here with the knight, like a knight to e5, and apply more pressure over f7 eventually. White has an intention, of course, of continuing this game, even though he's down a pawn. Like, and none of the initial traps that did work because the gambit was neutralized. Black continues bishop e7. It's important here to understand this reason for not swapping. We just gotta play a little bit defensive right now. By being solid, we are neutralizing completely any initiative of the white player. If we get to place our knight in d5, then we'd be just completely safe. So after a move like knight e5, best idea by white, we can take. If pawn takes back, then knight to d5, and it's like we're up a piece in here, according to the evaluation. Nothing will stop the black player from either winning material here on the queen side, one of these pawns, as soon as possible, or simplify and just go to trade knights, maybe the queen. And if white takes back with the bishop, for example, then the black player plays knight to d7 to still attack the bishop. This is because when white has an open file for the rook attacking the f file, playing a move like knight to d5 could be a problem because of the infiltration of the pieces, and we don't really have, especially after the trade of the knight in d5, we don't really have much defense over f6, g7, d squares. So knight to d7 to attack the bishop is important to neutralize the attack completely. So after bishop to f4, black continues with rook f to e8. And one last thing I'm going to mention, after knight to e4, white going all in on the king side, black plays f5, which now explains that the reason why the rook had to go to e8 in this type of situation is to put more control over the square e6, because he will be weak. It's a typical weak pawn. After f5 and knight to g5, black in an happily trade, bishop takes, and now black's best move is queen to a2, which indicates that there's absolutely nothing to worry when they play this opening.